Biography of Sakyamuni Buddha. Forward. I thank the corporate body of the Buddha Educational Foundation for permitting me to adapt their publication. The original book by Ganapada Edel, 1998, contains both English and Chinese captions. I hope that others will take this work further and translate this book into other languages, and also use it as a basis for a film, that more people can benefit from the Buddha 2019's exemplary life. May this work help to bring peace to all. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Homage to the Blessed One, the Consummate One, the Supremely Enlightened One. India, before the time of the Buddha, was called Jambudvipa. It was divided into many kingdoms, large and small, some of which were ruled by kings, and some of which were ruled jointly by several royal tribes. One of those many small kingdoms was called Kapilavatthu. It was located on the north bank of the Rapti River, on the rim of the Himalayas. The ruler of this kingdom was King Suddhodana of the Sakya clan. His family name was Gautama, and his queen was called Mahamaya. After they were married, King Suddhodana and Queen Mahamaya lived very happily together. After many years, the queen became pregnant. She asked the king to permit her to return to her home city of Devadaha to give birth to their child. King Suddhodana readily consented and ordered the troop of royal attendants to prepare for the trip and to clean up and beautify the roads the queen would travel on. At the junction of Kapilavatthu and the city of Devadaha was a place called Lumbini Park. Every summer, people of the two cities flocked to this park to rest or to play under the sala trees. They enjoyed the beautiful flowers blooming all over the tree branches, and the melodious twittering of birds and the humming of the ever-busy honeybee. The time Queen Mahamaya arrived at Lumbini Park was on the 15th of June, the full moon day, according to the reckoning of the Thai tradition.
This day is now, according to the solar calendar, the full moon day of May of every year. As the time was getting close to noon, the weather was very hot, so she ordered the troops to stop so that she could rest for a while in the shade of the trees. But before long, while walking around under the sala trees enjoying the beautiful scenery, she felt her birth pangs and soon after gave birth to a prince amidst the songs of birds and humming bees. Queen Mahamaya gave birth to the prince in the Lumbini Park, and the palace maids and her attendants were very busy in looking carefully after the queen and the prince. The palace maids also requested the queen and the prince to return to Kapilavatthu. King Suddhodana was very happy at the sight of the newborn prince. He ordered additional care for the queen and the prince. On the mountains outside Kapilavatthu lived many hermit sages. Among them was Asita, an old sage who was much respected by the people and King Suddhodana. When Asita found that the king was the proud father of a new prince, he rushed to the palace at Kapilavatthu in order to read the physiognomy of the prince. When the old sage arrived to the palace, King Suddhodana, to show reverence to Asita and expecting blessing from him, ordered that the prince be brought out. Asita looked attentively and discovered that the prince, indeed, had a look of great virtue in his facial expression. He was very excited, and a smile of joy appeared on his face, but almost as quickly a tear dropped from his eye. King Suddhodana was puzzled. He asked Asita why he wept. Asita replied, "The prince has the look of the great man. Someday he will attain enlightenment, perfect in both wisdom and virtue, and become the teacher and master of men." And Devasi wept because of my age. By the time the prince attains enlightenment and becomes the savior of the world, I shall not be around. After saying this, he knelt down to pay respect to the prince.
Unconsciously, King Suddhodana followed him, also kneeling down to the prince. 5 days after the prince's birth, King Suddhodana gathered many scholars in the palace hall in order to decide on the name of the prince. After conferring with each other, the scholars selected Siddhartha, which means realization of all aims, as the new prince's name. During the day of the naming ceremony, the scholars had a chance to view closely the virtuous look on the prince's face. They unanimously predicted, if the prince succeeds his father and becomes a king, he will become a Kakavati. But if, instead, he leaves home to pursue spiritual freedom, he will become a Buddha. But one young scholar, named Koa, firmly testified, when Prince Siddhartha grows up, he will abandon the throne in pursuit of supreme wisdom, and he will attain perfect enlightenment and become the first supreme teacher of the world. The people and scholars of the country all wished for the prince to become a universal monarch. When he grew up, King Suddhodana wished for this too. He certainly did not want his son to leave home and become a teacher, for he expected the prince, when the time came, to have a family like other human beings, raise children, and succeed him in ruling the country. 2 days after the prince was named, Queen Mahamaya died of some illness. Everybody was grief-stricken at this turn of events, but the saddest person was, of course, her husband King Suddhodana, for Queen Mahamaya was a woman of the highest caste and also the most virtuous of the ladies of the court. After Queen Mahamaya passed away, King Suddhodana entrusted another concubine with the task of taking care of the baby prince, Mahapajapati, Prince Siddhartha's aunt. She took care of the prince and brought him up with as much devotion as she would have shown to her own son. So, Prince Siddhartha never really knew his own mother. Under the careful eye of his aunt Mahapajapati, the prince gradually grew up.
He was very handsome and healthy, a perfect darling to everyone. When he was 8 years old, the king began to invite all kinds of masters to the palace to educate him in the skills of reading, composition, mathematics, archery, and other arts. Since every one of his teachers was an expert in his field, Prince Siddhartha completed all his studies with ease and thoroughness. When speed of progress and level of accomplishment were considered, his great abilities were apparent. People, including his teachers, father, and aunt, were really surprised to see that Prince Siddhartha really had no difficulty at all in learning anything. Once any skill or knowledge was demonstrated or explained, he immediately understood, remembered, and never forgot it. Even though Prince Siddhartha was such a clever pupil and, at the same time, the crown prince, the heir to the throne, he never neglected to treat his teachers with good manners and respect. For the prince believed that only through the instruction from teachers could men acquire knowledge of very great value. Besides, the nature of the prince was such that he treated everyone with equal friendliness and politeness. Prince Siddhartha's accomplishment in physical skill was no less than his virtuous conduct. Besides being friendly and polite, the prince was also very courageous. He never feared or hesitated when competing with other boys in various skills. During that time, all males of the royal tribe were educated to become gallant knights. The prince, since his early youth, had been trained to be a kind and brave knight, and he was also able to drive a chariot very skillfully. There was a chariot race, which the prince had won against the toughest rival in the country. Although the competition of this sort required that the participants struggle very hard for victory, yet the prince treated his horse gently. The horse, in return, also exerted its full strength and with all its might helped the prince to become the victor.
For the horse, too, felt that the prince should be only a winner, not a loser. The prince was gentle not only to his own horse, but he was kind also to all other animals. Being a crown prince, Siddhartha had never encountered suffering and misery in his life. But his sympathetic nature made him aware that all creatures, whether people or animals, equally like happiness and dislike suffering and pain. At the age of 8, the prince began to show, in his conduct, a particularly compassionate nature. In any place and on any occasion, he never intentionally harmed any creature. On the contrary, he tried to succor any suffering creature. For example, one day the prince saw one of his attendants beating a snake with a rod. He immediately stopped the attendant, telling him not to beat it. One day, Prince Siddhartha was playing with his companions in the palace garden. Among them was Devdatta, a cousin of Prince Siddhartha, whose personal character was entirely different from the prince's. Prince Siddhartha was friendly and polite, and his heart was full of kindness and compassion. He never oppressed others, but often helped the oppressed. Prince Devdatta was cruel and jealous and fond of killing. This day Devdatta was carrying his bow and arrows, shooting the flying swans for fun. One swan was shot in the wing and fell to the ground. It was badly wounded and appeared to be in much pain. Siddhartha quickly ran up to the swan and picked it up. Removing the arrow from its wing, he wrapped the wound with cool leaves to stop the blood and softly patted its body. Devdatta angrily stepped over to him, intending to snatch the swan, at the same time yelling at Siddhartha, demanding that he return the bird to him. Under no condition would Prince Siddhartha return the wounded bird to him. He said, if the bird had died, it would probably belong to the shooter. But as long as it is still alive, it naturally belongs to the saver.
But Prince Devdutta insisted, I shot the bird down, so it belongs to me. Finally Prince Siddhartha suggested, let the scholars of the country settle this argument at a conference. Prince Devdutta agreed to this. On the day when the scholars met to discuss various matters, there were plenty of disputes over the swan. They all had different opinions. Some said the bird should belong to Prince Siddhartha because he had saved its life. Some, on the contrary, believed that Prince Devdutta should have the bird because he had brought it down. Everyone seemed to have his own reason for choosing one point of view or another. Finally, a young scholar stood up, loudly proclaiming, all living creatures belong to those who save or guard their lives, not to those who damage their lives. In fact, this wounded bird shall belong to its savior, that is, Prince Siddhartha. The conferring scholars all accepted the statement made by their young colleague, unanimously deciding that the bird belonged to Prince Siddhartha, for he was the one who had saved its life. So Prince Siddhartha carefully nursed the swan until its wound had completely healed. Then he set the bird free to fly back to the forest to live a free and pleasant life among its own kind. From that day, Prince Devdutta began to hate Prince Siddhartha and secretly plot against him. Every one of these Indian people knew that everything they needed depended on the soil, and so they considered the tilling of the soil and the producing of food as their most important work, which would benefit the country as well as themselves. Hence, a yearly practice was observed in which the king and his ministers all went to the fields in person to take part in a tilling and plowing ceremony at seed sowing time. They did this to set an example for the people, showing them that plowing the soil and growing crops was not demeaning work, but was on the contrary, a great work that one could do.
In Kapalavathu, the end of summer marked the season for the farmers to start tilling. King Suddhodana and his officials customarily led the royal tiller festival outside the city every year. This was a big ceremony. The people of the city all came out to see the king plowing the land and to enjoy the very colorful feast. On this day also, Prince Siddhartha accompanied King Suddhodana to the ceremony. The king began the ceremony in the field. He raised a beautiful, gold-decorated plow and began to plow the land. A group of officials followed him, plowing the land with silver-decorated plows. The stiff brown mud was loosened and was then ready for seeding. At lunchtime, the attendants of Prince Siddhartha all went to enjoy the feast, leaving the prince alone. So Prince Siddhartha walked by himself to the shade of a thriving jambu tree, sat down, settled his mind by calming its whirling thoughts, and began to contemplate. The king, the officials, and the farmers are here to hold the royal tiller ceremony, and now they are happily feasting. But those oxen did not seem to be happy at all. They had to exert a force greater than their physical strength, to pull the plows and to break the hard earth. They toiled so much that they could not stop panting. Obviously, they were not happy. While the people here were enjoying themselves today, they all had to do hard work. And if, occasionally, they were to do something not quite up to their master's expectations, harsh threats and merciless whips would fall on them. The prince also noticed the activities of various other creatures around him. He saw a lizard, which was crawling out from a crevice in the earth, catching and eating working ants with its tongue. Shortly afterwards, a snake approached, killed the lizard by biting through its head and swallowing it. Just at that moment, the prince was astonished to see a hawk suddenly descend from the sky, seize the snake, tear it apart and eat it. Siddhartha again went into deeper thought and began to ask himself, if things are like that, then is it not true that which is said to be beautiful in life will also have an ugly part? At last the prince came to realize that although he was very happy now, there was however a kind of great suffering that was always present for mankind and all beings. Although the Prince Siddhartha was still young, he was able to have such profound thoughts and to attain to the state of detachment from all sensual things and enter into the first meditation absorption, first jhana. When the royal tiller ceremony and the feast were over, the attendants began to think of the prince. They rushed back to him and found the prince sitting motionless under the jambu tree like a stone statue. They awakened him and told him that the king was looking for you, for it was time to go home. On the way, Prince Siddhartha felt compassion for all creatures, because every single creature, while keeping itself alive, has to struggle constantly against pain and suffering. Knowing that the prince had thought about the ultimate truth troubled King Siddhartha. He feared that if such thoughts were not eliminated, the prince probably would soon leave him and abandon the country, and then there would be no one to inherit the throne. He felt that the only way to change the prince's mind was to double the happiness and pleasure available to him in the royal palace. To achieve this end, his first plan was to construct 3 splendid new palaces. The first palace was built of fragrant wood. Inside, the air was warm, and everything was designed for maximum comfort. This was the prince's winter palace. The second was the prince's summer palace, which was built of polished marble. The third palace, built of brick, had a green tiled roof. This was the prince's lodge in the monsoon season.